Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Digital Leaders Show, where each week we discuss key issues and news at the intersection of business, technology, and the humanities in hopes of making you a better digital leader. This week, we're discussing headlines from the world of enterprise tech and transformation, including more ChatGPT and AI use cases and the real reasons behind the tech layoffs. We're live each Wednesday at noon Eastern, 9 Pacific, 6 Central European Time on YouTube, LinkedIn, and Twitter. And the audio recording is available on major podcast platforms later this week. Don't forget to check us out at DEInetwork.com for executive coaching, industry briefings, and peer-to-peer custom research. I'm Dan Goodstein. I head up Digital Enterprise Institute and IRPA AI. It's the Institute for Robotic Process Automation and Artificial Intelligence. We're a professional association and peer-to-peer research network providing education, networking, and advice to over 130,000 members globally, all around automation, AI, and digital transformation. My co-host, as always, is Carlos Alvarenga, a researcher, author, educator at the University of Maryland in Georgetown, former advisor with EY and Accenture, and recently founded the E4S Foundation to provide financial support to students pursuing a degree in the career of journalism. Carlos, good to see you as always.
Yeah, good to see you as always.
So, Carlos, I tried really, really hard this morning to come up with a topic that was different from the last few weeks. And I found out that you can't. In fact, I asked ChatGPT and it told me that that was the only thing in the news.
All right. Decided that that's all we can talk about from now on.
I think that's it. I think that's the only thing. I mean, if you spend any time on LinkedIn or anything, I think even any time in front of a computer these days, it seems to be all everyone is talking about. There's a whole bunch of, new applications. Apparently, this thing can get a degree from Wharton MBA. Microsoft is rumored to be building this into their Bing search. Based on their recent investment. Google is reportedly accelerating the launch of their competitive product and also talking about some interim kind of facelifts for their Google search in the meantime. So I think the search space is about to change for sure. And I also read a report that China is kind of entering the space race, if you will, with something called Baidu. Their answer to ChatGPT. Probably with its own kinds of restrictions and interesting, unique value props, but wild time.
It is, and Baidu's right, just China's kind of Google, and my sense was that this has kind of put a little bit of fear into the team at Google that has kind of had it their way right for a couple of decades now, and so maybe we probably are overdue for something to come by and really sort of rethink what search is. The thing that struck me the most about ChatGPT, and again, like you, I thought we could not talk about it this week, but then I read the article from the Wharton professor who talks about giving ChatGPT the exams of one of its MBA classes and how well it did. It answered it, more or less right and wrote extremely well. So now, again, we're at this cusp of this technology that's been talked about for so long that can come in and act and react the way a human can. It has been science fiction for 4 or 5 decades, but perhaps we are now crossing that threshold, Dan, where we can now sit side by side with a machine that can process information and at least at some level, operate in a kind of level the same way that a human being can, in these kinds of settings.
Yeah, it's really remarkable. This Wharton piece, basically saying that this thing could get an MBA, but there were other examples this week as well, as far as this thing going into more implementation, right? I mean, if you think about where we are today, most of the existing use cases around AI have been really about classification and identification and NLP, natural language processing, being able to convert things into text and character recognition, computer vision, identifying objects in a crowd, for example. It's a lot of the technology behind the self-driving cars. But now you're really seeing this evolution. And, as we've talked about, it's not just, what ChatGPT can do, but this kind of new generative AI, which is, going beyond classification. It's allowing the AI to create high value objects, video, text, programming, larger scale NLP with deep learning. And then this most recent generation that not only can create and is learning from the text, but can actually predict the next most likely word in a sentence or in some computer code. And so, what's the really exciting part on, I was going to say beyond the hype, but I don't think it's really hyped. I think it's just kind of excitement is, as you start bringing this into some enterprise use cases, right? There's already a handful of really interesting use cases that I've seen as far as applying this into, the B2B enterprise world.
I think when I think about it, and I really read this article very carefully, thinking about my own experience teaching. What strikes me is that Google, when it first came up right out, what was so exciting about it is that it added to human memory, right? It really didn't do very much else, but it did that in such a remarkable way that suddenly, if you couldn't remember, right, what movie won the Oscar in 1962, with your fingertips, there was this little machine, this little box that could then recall for you, right? Oh, by the way, this is that, and then he's ever the winner, right, system to now. But it has operated mostly as an external memory, right, to human beings, the way a calculator did calculation for us. A lot of times ChatGPT, and if you spend any time on it, it's not that, right? It's what it's saying is it's kind of analysis, right? It's synthesis. So this is a very different part of kind of what your brain does, right? This is collects information and then sort of tries to make sense of it. So unlike unlike search, right? What GPT says, let me help you put together, right, a whole bunch of pieces of information so you have a cohesive sense of what a subject is, a theme, a question, right? This is an operations research class actually that was in fact, the ChatGPT struggled with the most was actually basic math.
Right.
It's a higher order thing, which ironically the computer wasn't that great at math, but it was pretty good at synthesizing sort of big ideas. When I look at Dolly, I see a little bit different thing because there we get into creativity, right? So again, a different kind of cognitive function, or let's say mental function, which is the invention, right, or the creation of ideas or art or music. And now we have another machine that comes along and says, okay, as you sit down and write music or come up with images, I can assist you in that process, right, and stimulate kind of thought back and forth. So to me, that's what's really interesting is that we've moved beyond the first version of this, right, where the machine is a memory aid, to now what's so exciting about this next one is that, okay, now we've got a machine that helps you comprehend more and a machine that can help you create or invent more, right? And that's, I think, what is different about here, right? And it's been talked about for so long that now we see the beginnings of it, and it is a big deal. I think all these articles are not hype. In fact, I think it's underhyped, right? If it accelerates the way search has accelerated in the next 10 years, I mean, in its first 10 years, right, we come back and even at the end of this decade, it's possible to imagine what these machines are going to be doing.
Yeah, yeah, and there's already use cases in huge use cases in the manufacturing space, which I think was maybe some of the early ones, but also in media, in engineering, in utilities, in healthcare and pharma. This report that came out of CDO is talking about what they think are the kind of top 5 enterprise use cases, and something that you mentioned a while back, Carlos. Drug design is top of that list, and then material science, chip design, design of parts and synthetic data. But a lot of the stuff that we talk about is around software and technology, which I want to get to. But you kind of called the drug design thing many months ago, I think.
Well, my wife's a researcher and a scientist, and the, as in her lab and in her team, as they try to invent right combinations of chemicals that will execute sort of function right within the brain, mostly the human body. It just takes so much time. It can be a year and a half, right, for something to be designed, for the protocol to be created, for you to be able to test it and see whether it works or not. Anything that comes along and says, okay, I'm going to cut that in half or in two-thirds, it radically alters the landscape of the kind of work that people like her do. Because some right now, the physical process takes so long. If you can create the thing I looked at, I think was a kind of artificial brain, right? That into which you could inject chemicals, you know, execute certain processes, see whether these sort of markers sort of work or not, scan it like a real brain. Then the ability to do that in a synthetic, right, artificial, quote unquote, way would change the nature of medical research in a way that it just wouldn't be recognizable today. Most research fails, right? Because it's the nature of like innovation. Most innovation sort of fails, but you hope that the ones you get right are significant and material and can change the world and for the better. But anything that accelerates that cycle becomes a really radical game changer for science, for innovation, for technology, and manufacturing, like you said. It's already the case, right? We saw it with additive manufacturing was already being used, right? I follow auto racing a lot, and you can put together a car today, right, or the machine print parts. It's just remarkable. The impact that's there is already there. Add to that intelligence that you see kind of already beginning to be born in things like ChatGPT, and yeah, manufacturing looks very different 10 years from now than from today.
The other area which they mention in this piece, which I hadn't really thought about, but is a great point, is the synthetic data. And as you allude to, that's a big part of medical research, but it's also a big part of software testing, right? And so one of the challenges is, how do I see if these systems, these automated systems, these intelligent automation systems, how do I see if they really work at scale? And the common tactic, which a lot of organizations use when they implement these programs, which on its face makes sense, which is, hey, I'll give you a sample set of data, so I don't bet the house on this, and let's see if it works. But with a lot of these intelligent and AI centric systems, you can't reach the real potential without the scale. And so how do you really draw a line to real transformation without going beyond the silo, the function, the sample set of data. And so the ability for this to, put in data like that, sort of test data, so-called test data, I think actually takes a lot of these things to the next level. You add real intelligence that can cross silos, cross functions within an organization, and you really start getting to the promise that we've all talked about for so long of true digital transformation, and even ties to something that I think has been significantly underserved, in this space, which is the customer experience side of things. Our guest next week is an expert in customer experience technology, and looking forward to that. But the more one of the challenges he always talks about, and I've heard throughout the industry, is the ability for any system to really be able to go and look at you as a customer 360 degrees around in various different areas, different departments, and the like, and actually be able to give you an intelligent answer. Now we start getting closer to that.
Well, I think the two things that say to you talk. One is something that any CIO has talked about, at least on Saturday Consulting, and that was just data cleansing, right? How many conversations have you been in when you asked a question? When I was in supply chain, how many parts do we buy from company X, right? So we know they're a supplier, but where and when, and let's say a huge automotive tier one kind of supply chain, right? A Ford, GM, or something like that, and nobody knows, right? It's at least it was almost impossible to say, okay, with any certainty, because the suppliers, right? If it's a big global supplier, they have a different name in a different country, different entity. So this always held back, right? A lot of things that people wanted to do in spaces like supply chain management. If now a version of this comes along and you tell, okay, I want you to go find everything that we buy from Visteon, wherever it is in the world, under whatever name, code, and legal entity, direct or indirect, right? And then show me, right, what our spend is with this particular vendor. That's just something that, again, right, is something that wasn't, it's been impossible to do. The other thing that strikes me is I read more and more about what I would call sort of humanless environments, right? So there was an article that came out a couple weeks ago about uh, startups that are trying to create the first people-less restaurants. So the idea of going to a restaurant and having basically no human interaction. uh, this is another thing that we've talked about before, that Silicon Valley is in a war with people, right? At least certain types of people, and it wants to eliminate them, take away their jobs, and make all those jobs obsolete. So I don't see why within a decade, right, you won't walk into a restaurant and there won't be a single person. And I don't mean just mean in the front. I mean in the kitchens and the serving staff. They're just what we think of as a restaurant, as a place where you interact with a waiter or right, somebody at the front that's cooks and chefs. It could all go away within a decade, right, Dan?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's the thing. Retail, right? Retail's been headed this way, right? We see it already in the Amazon stores, right? The push to eliminate human beings. So we're headed, it looks like, right, to this world of these humanless spaces where we will walk into a space that used to contain people, but as customers now they don't. And you wonder, and it's the thing about the MBA class, right? Will we see humanless classrooms within the next decade as well? Right? You walk in, take your seat, the robot, doctor, professor robot gets up, does its thing, and so we now move into this new world of things that used to contain people. The people are gone.
Yeah, and I think you're starting to see little glimpses of it, right?
Yeah.
There's a hockey arena by me where I go a lot, and right outside where my seats are, there's a Amazon store. I forget the exact name, but this is one of these automated stores. So you can go into that store. There's a million cameras and a little door, and you walk in and you pick up whatever you want off the shelf. You put your card in first,
Yep.
and you go in and you grab whatever you want off the shelf. And I've tested it, right? Being in the space, I pick things up and put them back down. I've handed things to my daughter, picked it up, handed it to her, see how it works. And it works, and it's amazing. It's the only place in the stadium that doesn't have a line. And the people, there are people working there, but what's interesting is the people aren't working there for the store. They're working there because of the people, the customers who don't believe it or understand it, or understand why they've got to put their credit card in first before they can walk into the store. But I think it's called Amazon Go. But that's why the people are there, and they don't. By the way, they don't need to be there. They're just standing there and doing absolutely nothing. So they'll be gone soon. I think we were talking off air this week about McDonald's, is testing out an AI drive-through, a personless drive-through technology. I think initially with some mixed results, but with this advancement, I think it's going to change. I think it was unrelated, but I'm not sure if it's the same technology that McDonald's is using, but some really interesting, AI fueled technology where someone's ordering from a menu board, like a, drive-through fast food type of restaurant, and is purposely very complicated and indecisive. And this ability for it to predict what you're going to do based on past data, and learn from order experiences. It was able to do something that I've never seen a machine be able to do, which was, after adding 4 or 5 things to the order, realizing that the first thing in the order, which was ice cream, they didn't want sprinkles on the ice cream, and the system knew enough that they weren't saying they didn't want sprinkles on their hamburger, right? And actually knew to go back up to the ice cream and change that and tweak that. And so that technology is seemingly there today. hasn't been implemented at scale. But once it does, I think you're going to see this everywhere you go.
Well, this goes back to the article we talked about, which is the again the layoffs, right? And how much of the tech layoff, at least the writer's thesis was that a big chunk of it is AI. It's a lot of the layoffs are coming from HR, and the people who are laid off are not typical sort of early hires, right? I think the average age, I mean, the tenure has been about 11 to 12 years of experience. And so the thesis was that, listen, machines are just replacing things like onboarding, right? Training, a lot of these things that used to be sort of human-centered activities in the HR world, just being given to robots. So the people who did them before just aren't needed. How many companies today, like you onboard yourself, right? The machine goes, "Hey, welcome back, Carlos. Right? I saw you're on step 3 of the onboarding process. Here's step 4. Watch these videos, take this test, or whatever it is." And it's a robot that's completing your journey into and out of a company, probably in the future, not a person.
It's the part that people are. By the way, you did that thing where you gave the punchline of the joke without setting up the joke that I was planning on telling. But no, you're absolutely right, and it's a good segue to the layoffs conversation because I think it's something that is not being publicized by some of the companies that are doing it, probably on purpose, and is kind of the reading between the lines that a lot of people aren't seeing. But just take a half step back, right? There's been about 150,000 layoffs within big tech companies. And most of them in the announcements and press releases and stuff, have cited cost cutting as the main reason. And I think I even mentioned it on the show a couple of weeks ago when it seemed like in the same sentence, Microsoft is announcing, their layoffs and then announcing the investment in ChatGPT. I think I said, hey, watch out. That's not a coincidence, that the timing of that. And so Forbes came out with this article this week, kind of agreeing with that, saying, the total investment they're making in ChatGPT is essentially would equate to $1 million per employee that they laid off. Right. So, people have been talking about why the layoffs happened, and we've talked about it too, right? A little bit of the hiring spree during COVID-19. Apparently salaries hit a record highs during that process because it got really, really competitive very, very quickly. But you're right. This according to this Forbes reporting, it turns out that the tech company jobs, first of all, were not all tech jobs that
Right.
were lost, right? And so 28% of them were HR. Some of that is just based on the fact that you don't need to hire and manage employees that you're laying off. But you're right. And I know, based on your consulting background, I mean, we've had a lot of conversations even before automation and AI, dating back to our outsourcing institute days. One of the first things was HR, right? And now with the level of maturity, and I hadn't thought about this till this conversation, but if you think about all of the new or experimental use cases of AI, the HR space has been very mature, as it relates to automation and HR for a long time, right? There's a lot of platforms in this space
Yeah.
that are widely accepted. There's a lot of automation around tasks for interviewing and onboarding, like you say, checking references, verifying identities, doing assessments. I think Amazon even had an AI tool supposedly to identify low performing staff members, figure out who to let go. So it's been a level of maturity in the HR space that maybe not as much in some other functions.
Yeah, and I think that this question of you make up outsourcing. I think it's a relevant topic. I wrote a paper when I was at Accenture about outsourcing. One of the things that I say in the paper is that whether your job gets outsourced or not has nothing to do with whether you do well or not, or it doesn't necessarily have anything to do. What it can have, but what can also be occurring is that the job that you own creates more value for someone outside the company than it does and for you than you create inside the company, right? And so when suddenly an external player figures out a way to create more value with the activity that you do inside that company for them, either because of scale or because of automation or technology, whatever it happens to be, then suddenly having that job is worth more to the company that's going to start asking, for those roles than the company that's going to be asked to give them up. Mm. And so that ultimately drove outsourcing and supply chain that when I started writing about it, everybody thought was impossible. And in fact, that's exactly what's happened. And so in by supply chain, I mean the higher order things like analytics and forecasting and planning, which people thought, well, nobody will give that up, but they will, right? What matters in the end is where is more value created. And I think that this is, to me, the fundamental question of white collar labor, right? And that is, is the role that I perform, right? Does it create enough value that it is safe from someone who has a very good machine just coming into my CEO's office tomorrow and saying, you know what, my machine can do that job better, faster, with less errors than your people can. The day that happens, your job is done. And we've seen it for 2 decades, right, Dan? And there is no role that is safe from this evolution.
Well, and the argument for a long time, I remember, and not to say this is the exact same thing as chatbots. Chatbots is an overused term, but I remember when chatbots first came out, the resistance was, hey, I'm not going to put high value customers or tasks
Yeah.
towards the chatbot because my customers want to deal with people. Same thing with customer service. Same thing with, food, entertainment, retail. I got to say, I've said this before. I can't remember the last time that my human experience in one of those places was a positive one, right? So if the technology can get to a place where it provides a better experience, I think it's a low benchmark, to be honest with you. I mean, I had a call yesterday with my bank where I could have done that via chatbot. It was a terrible experience. And if the only thing that would have made that experience better is if it was quicker. If I would have got the same answer from the rude person on the other side of the phone who couldn't care less about my business, if I would have gotten that answer in 37 seconds instead of having to call and speak to a chatbot who told me then to call, who then would sit on phone for 10 minutes to get transferred, put all my information in for them to give me the one-line answer that she gave me.
Look, the gold
Not a good experience, right?
is an Amazon return, right? So you want to return something, you talk to the robot, right? You click to the robot, ask you why you want to bring it back. I don't like it anymore. It came too late, whatever the reason is. Okay, what do you want with that refund? Back to that. What do you want to drop it off, etc. In 2 seconds, right? What used to be a call to handle a return with somebody is done by the machine, and the machine does a phenomenal job. I think the interesting question is back to our topic in our name, right? The digital leader. So then, if this is really the case, right, and I believe that we are seeing the beginning of this, then what does leadership mean in this kind of world, right? Where leadership is in one part the elimination of labor and turning over labor to machines as quickly as you can, as efficiently as you can, because the machines are just better. On the other hand, the other part of leading means those who stay behind, those who still have a place, right? What are you leading? Or where are you leading them to? The inevitable replacement by a machine, or some kind of coexistence a decade from now? And what does that coexistence sort of looks like? And I know this is like a metaphysical question, but I think it is a huge issue for just leadership in general in business, because this is as an outsider, right? I'm a writer now, so I'm not in the middle of all this, but as someone who's an observer, this is what I see and write about, is that if you're any senior executive in technology today is leading his organization down 2 paths. One is to eliminate as many of you as possible, and then some other thing that has to be defined for those who remain.
I think, Carlos, the answer is that we have to stop pretending that this isn't happening. And I've been the first one to say, hey, AI won't take jobs directly, right? And the reality is that it is going to take some jobs, and we've talked about it on the show, right? It's going to change the jobs, and whether or not the company wants to, do layoffs or repurpose people, is a corporate decision. And I think that they're already making these decisions. But I think we have to stop pretending that that this isn't happening. I think, we're at a really key inflection point. By the way, the last stat, from that Forbes piece that I want to underscore is, according to LinkedIn, only 10% of those laid off
Yeah.
have listed that they have a new job on their LinkedIn profiles. Okay, so there's a little bit of drag there. Okay, maybe a couple of them haven't done it yet, right? But that's a significant number to me. The timing with the AI stuff, the ChatGPT stuff, Microsoft's investment. This is not a coincidence, right? So I think we've finally gotten to this big inflection point of, to your point, people versus technology, right? And we talked about this being maybe more of a reshuffle. I think we're getting to a point of, let's call it the great rebalancing, where certain jobs are not coming back. First, you have this resignation, the great resignation. Then you have all these hiring challenges. You have workers getting more and more demanding. Bloomberg said this week that offices in the U.S., physical offices in the U.S., reached over 50% occupancy for the first time since the pandemic, but they're predicting that it doesn't go any higher. Right. So you have more work from home, more kind of defiance and more demanding employees. Now you have the mass layoffs. Right. And so I think we're at this point where companies finally change the way they get work done. So let's be honest about it. Let's go to these people that are applying for the jobs who just got laid off and said, hey, that job that you left isn't going to be there in a year. Let's figure out how we, like we talked about with ChatGPT, how do we teach you to use technologies like that to do a better job, to be more marketable. And I think as an employer, we've got to stop pretending that, we're going to keep people in jobs that they're not going to be good at, or that they don't want to do, or that won't exist in 2 years, because it would be a shame to not use this opportunity to re-educate and retool the workforce to where things are going, instead of trying to put them in jobs from 10 years ago.
Look, we've had these 3 waves of machines, right? Going back to the Industrial Revolution, when suddenly machines came along and entered the factory, right? And then the machines took over in many cases, or radically reshaped work. So you had craft work, right? You made a car, and it was all done by hand. Along comes Henry Ford, and Henry Ford says, no, the human's job isn't to build a car, right? It's to make sure that this wheel has this particular piece on it. And that's it. So the role of the person was subservient to the design of the machine, right? This goes back to Taylorism and that whole concept of the assembly line. This was pretty much the model in manufacturing, right? Until you get the technology wave of the 70s. And so now you get robots, the beginning of the internet a little bit later. And so the robots came, and suddenly the machines again redefined work for humans. When the internet came, the internet once again, right, told the human beings, hey, the machines are going to redefine work. Now you have to have a laptop. You have to be able to work through Microsoft Office. You have all these things that you have to be able to do that you didn't have to do before, right, in order to be a kind of white collar worker. Well, if this is the next one, right? Now this is 30 years later from that, call it that 3rd or 4th wave, then it's just the machines are doing it again. They've done it before 4 or 5 times. And so now we're in this 4th or 5th wave where a whole new set of machines will enter the workplace and say, you know what, I know you were comfortable working this way, but now it's all going to change. And it took about 20 years to work that through last time. This, I think, will go faster. I think in the next decade, we'll come back in the middle of the next decade and see a radically different way of working and interacting with these new generation of machines. But it's the 4th or 5th time. It's just innovation, right? Dan, the machines come in and say, this is the way work is going to be from now on. And this has been happening since the late 1800s.
Yeah, it has. And, like you say, it's, this, we've seen this movie before, but for whatever reason, it's human nature, I guess. People just resist change and don't think it's going to happen in their generation, or they think it's overhyped, or whatever the reason was. It's funny to watch technology people that talk about the past history, industrial revolution and things, but then don't think it's going to happen that way again. But I think you're right. I think we're at a .com moment, where I think everything is going to be AI. What the challenge will be to find out what's real and what's not, and get back to solutions versus features, and a lot of those conversations that we have. But yeah,
but I think we've seen this progression is that the skill set of those affected is higher and higher.
right.
So in the first round you had you know very basic tasks, right? So most people who were not that well educated, it was called low skill labor, right? When the robots came in manufacturing in the 70s and 60s, right, that they were skilled manufacturing workers that were impacted. When the IT revolution came in the 70s, right, those were skilled programmers in the US and other places that were impacted. When the internet came, the same, even higher skill set, right? And so the one thing we know is that with each round of the machine coming back, it goes higher and higher up the value chain. And that's why when you read the article and you say it's HR people, programmers, these are not low skill roles in these companies, right? And these are the companies which means that, oh, by the way, if they're at Google and Amazon, they're very good because they're working in very good jobs at the very best companies. So, and that's the ones the robots are going after.
Yeah.
So this next round, and which means that eventually, right, every time the machines come back, they're one rung higher up the ladder. And I think that's the part and which means that in each case, right, the people who are affected by this is, I think, is your point. I agree with you completely that the social and political business leaders do a really bad job of admitting this.
Yeah.
Of telling people, look, this is what's really going to happen. This is going to be the real impact. And I think that's the problem. Right? We think back to outsourcing and manufacturing and in IT, and did nobody ever told Americans, right, what was coming? Which is, I always say, America's going to build 5 great cities in the next 2 decades. It just won't make it. It just won't build them here, right? And so this tremendous transfer of wealth that went from the U.S. to India and China, and I have never heard, right, during those years politicians saying, "Look, this is the reality of what's going on, guys. Let's try to deal with this." Now we're dealing with the aftermath of that, whether it was active or passive, right, unwillingness to deal with the reality. I think the same thing is happening now. Who in this crop of people running for president, the next crop that's coming, or the one who just ran, talked about this issue?
Or understands this issue even, right? And you're right. I think, I'm amazed. I said last week watching the hearings with with Ticketmaster, having these politicians ask questions about bots and technology and things, and it's just very clear that no idea what they're talking about. And so that's part of it. But I wonder, and by the way, for anybody watching, feel free to chime in. I know we've got a few dozen people watching live, so let us know what you think. Let us know what questions you have. I remember, Carlos, when I first got into the beginning of my career and getting into the outsourcing space. I remember we'd be, doing all this research and speaking to customers about outsourcing, speaking to vendors about outsourcing, tech companies. I'd be in these meetings. And I got to the point, a few years in where I'm like, okay, I have a good handle on what this is. And then I remember one of the presidential elections and outsourcing came up like it did a lot, in presidential elections. And I'm like, what are they talking about? Like, it was the first time where I was really an expert in something, not just a watcher of the news, but I was a subject matter expert. And I'm like, either these guys have absolutely no idea what they're talking about, or they do, and they're just saying whatever people want to hear, for political reasons. And listen, that wouldn't be the first time that politicians tell people what they want to hear, but I think what you're alluding to, which is, something I've felt for a while, is being done better. I guess I'm talking about the U.S. now. I think has been done better in other countries, in the UK and in Europe, where they have a more realistic conversation with the population, and they're making better investments in the future. in opposed to trying to delay the inevitable with industries that are just not going to exist the way they do. I mean, if you look at the Fortune 500, right, the S&P, the amount of the balance of kind of the traditional firms from 50 years ago and tech firms. I mean, it's not rocket science.
I think one other thing too, and this is another philosophical point, which makes those conversations easier in other countries, is that no country, at least that I've spent time, is so unites identity and work as the U.S. Right? There are countries that spend some time in certain countries in South America. You never ask somebody what they do for a living, right? If it
But
comes up,
that's what soccer match they watch. What
right?
soccer team they watch.
Yeah, you talk about anything but that. You don't talk about money. You don't talk about what they do. If it comes up, it comes up. Here, it's this first, second question. So what do you do, Dan? Right? And it's so automatic that we don't think about the fact that in our society, your job. This is why it's so traumatic for people who when they're laid off, right, in this country, and having had to lay people off. I know this firsthand because we there's a sense of, well, you're nothing then, right? If you're unemployed, you must not be anybody because you have no job. So we have this double problem, right? That in the country's almost schizophrenic, right? On the one hand, it places this incredible importance, right, on your professional identity, while a big chunk of the country is doing everything it can to make those identities disappear through technology. So and so, okay, what do you get? You get a workforce that doesn't know what to do, or at least in some part, right? Should I double down on work, right? But at the same time, that I know that all the geniuses in the valley are trying to make me obsolete. Why would I invest 10 years in a professional identity that could disappear because of ChatGPT? Right. This is the bigger question, I think, socially, that we have built a society that connects professional identity and personal identity, at least pre-COVID, right, in a way that's unmatched, I believe, anywhere in the world. Maybe China, I don't know. Uh, but at the same time, we're now in an arms race to make jobs go away.
It's a really interesting point, and I think I mean, without getting super around philosophy, but you think about just people's journeys around identity and one of the most interesting guys I met long ago. He was an executive in a startup, and he used to start every talk that he did by saying, I'm a recovering attorney. And it was a little tease on lawyers, but he really was a lawyer and kind of pivoted and changed careers, and it was his way of kind of telling the story. I know you're big on storytelling. We talked about storytelling last week. It was his way of telling the story that the legal profession wasn't for him, and he had evolved and into other things, and so he told his journey from being a lawyer, and then what he did after that, and then what he was doing now, and what he wanted to do. And it was just it's a very interesting kind of anecdote around, not even just decoupling people's identities from work, but the fact that our work evolves, right? It's not going to be what you graduated college for, and what you do when you retire, if you retire, ever, are going to be different things, right? So that's what I think. That's the storyline that I think politicians and digital leaders and people need to start talking about. It's about, like everything in life, it's about the journey, and where you're going on that journey, not trying to hold on to what you did, and what you did 20 years ago. I mean,
Look,
it's
and
just not the world.
also there's the reality that for so many people in business, whatever they do isn't their first choice, right? It's they're
A
there
lot of
because of
times.
money, or because of obligations. And I don't mean, and I mean, yeah, I've met CEO. I mean, I work for a CEO who over dinner would tell you that the thing that they would really love to do is to be a carpenter, right? And so because they were a phenomenal carpenter in real life, and I'm pretty sure that if he had the choice, he would have just walked away and just built cabinets, homes his whole life. But you couldn't, because there are other things that keep you in the kind of professional space, whether it's money or ego or obligations or family, whatever it happens to be. So this tension between what an individual wishes he or she could do today and the reality of what they must do today, right, already creates a problem. If I add to that, right, add to that uh, the fear that some unknown company you've never heard of is going to invent a machine tomorrow that will make your job kind of obsolete, right? In a country where if you don't have a job, you're sort of like no one, then that is a high anxiety society, right? And it's hard, especially when you leave the even for me, right, on a personal level. I was going through LinkedIn, I think, in January, and just like putting my title, I was going to put just like writer, which is kind of what I am. And I thought, well, that doesn't sound good enough. I'll add a couple other things too, right? But it's not really. I should just put writer. That's it. But I came from a world where it was global managing director of this and vice president of that, right? And so it's very hard to finally cut your brain away from title itis, right? And this need to, especially what you see it on LinkedIn, is almost a pathology of not just inflating who you are, but every minor accomplishment broadcasting to the universe, right? I I finished some ISO 9012, right, course, whatever.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I'm going to tell the whole world, right, that I just why? Who cares? Right?
But that philosophical thing that you're talking about identity is accurate. It's a part of it. In fact, it's funny you mentioned it because we just put a poll out through our sister organization ERPA AI yesterday about how many hours a week you work, and everybody's kind of like the initial round of people were like, well, I work 60 hours, 80, and it became like, oh, the more I work, the better I am, and I kind of looked at it and said, I think it should be the opposite, right? It should be if you can accomplish your goals in
Yeah,
the least amount, it's like a race, right? And then you have to do all these obstacles in the least amount of time possible.
yeah,
That's the promise, and I think that's the opportunity here, right? Is to say, if we can, maybe it's not decoupling, the identity of who we are, but the decoupling this idea that you have to work a million hours and I think we're seeing that, right, with the great resignation stuff, where people don't want to spend 100 hours of work a week working, especially for somebody else, where if we can adapt our skill sets to work with AI and get to a point where we can actually get the same or more done in less time, then our identity becomes about more than work. It
right.
becomes about what we do with our free time, right?
Look, I think this is the question. It is, especially for executives who I've met who retire from consulting and then they go crazy,
Right.
right? In other places too, they're really upset, and I understand why. 6 months ago, you were CXO, and it took a year to get on your calendar, right? And then suddenly you're available. The crickets are chirping, and you're trying to get on some nonprofit board just to keep some kind of identity, right? Sort of post retirement. And these are people, they've got all the money in the world. They don't need to do anything, but they go into a kind of psychological, not all of them, because some of them are fine, right? But some of them go into a real crisis of you don't matter anymore. No one's calling you for a quote. No one's calling for your an opinion.
Sense of purpose, right?
And I think that this is the key thing is define like who am I, not what am I, right? Who am I in this new world of work, right? And to the extent you can, creating a relationship between yourself and your job that is not codependent, right?
And that's a good, right? Retirees is a great example. The other from that Forbes report, of the layoffs, 56% were female. Which is obviously worrying. Being that the tech industry spends so much time trying to address the gender imbalance. That you see that around that population as well. Around what's my identity? Is it being a mother? Is it being a career person? How do I balance those
But
those
tell me
things? Right?
how screwed up that is, right? Because I'm sure 57% isn't the ratio on the hires, right? So whatever the hire ratio is, it's a fraction of the layoff. When it comes down to layoff, it's 50-50, or maybe even worse, right? That's not the case when it comes time to hire. There,
Yeah.
the ratios, if you add a few percentage points, you growl about it and say how happy you are. So look, I think all to me anyway, taking a step back, right? All these articles of GPT, maybe we can now talk about ChatGPT next week. But what it, I take it, I distill it to a sense of yes, this is the next wave of machines that will redefine work in the next decade. And if that is the case, then everyone needs to ask him or herself, okay, what happens to me during this redefinition?
Carlos, we'll leave it there. Good advice. And just a reminder for you that are watching, we're here to help. If you need help with a project or just want to get some advice, message me or visit us on DEInetwork.com. In the meantime, we'll be back next Wednesday, live at noon Eastern, 9 Pacific. Have a great week, everyone. Carlos, thank you so much.
See you again, Dan. See you next week. Bye-bye.